A crisp winter morning unfolded quietly outside a suburban high school. The sound of a ringing bell marked the end of a routine school day, and students flooded the yard. Among them was a girl, no older than 15, her braided hair shimmering under the pale sunlight as she adjusted her backpack. The joy of finishing another day lingered on her face, until it happened. "Hey, you!" The sharp, authoritative voice cut through the chatter like a blade. She turned, her brows furrowed in confusion. A police officer stood a few steps away, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and disdain. "You think I didn't see what you just did?" he barked, closing the distance between them. The yard went silent. A group of students stopped to stare, their murmurs quickly dying out as they sensed the hostility in the air. "I don't understand," the girl stammered, clutching the straps of her bag. "What did I do?" The officer's lips curled into a cold sneer. "Don't play dumb with me. I got a report of stolen items in this school. You look like the type who'd do something like that." Her cheeks flushed. "I didn't take anything." "I don't even, empty your bag," he ordered, his hand resting on his holster. The girl hesitated, her hands trembling. The humiliation swelled within her chest as the crowd of students around them grew. She wasn't a thief. She knew it, but there was something deeper behind the officer's accusation, something she couldn't name but could feel in his tone and his eyes. "Now," he barked again, louder this time. Her voice cracked. "You're wrong. I didn't take anything. Why are you doing this?" He didn't respond. Instead, he snatched the bag from her shoulder and dumped its contents onto the concrete. Books, notebooks, and a half-eaten sandwich spilled out. The crowd gasped as the officer's hands rifled through the pile. "Where is it?" he muttered under his breath before shooting her a glare. "Where's the stolen phone? You're hiding something." The girl's face turned red as she struggled to hold back tears. "I didn't take anything. Please, believe me." The officer straightened up, towering over her. He grabbed her arm, dragging her toward a nearby dumpster. "Maybe this will teach you a lesson," he hissed, shoving the lid open. "No. Stop," she screamed, thrashing against his grip. But he was stronger, and her protests were drowned out by the murmurs of the crowd. A deafening silence fell as he forced her toward the dumpster, lifting her just enough to toss her in. She landed with a painful thud among crumpled papers and rotting food. Tears streamed down her face as the humiliation engulfed her. The crowd didn't intervene, some were too stunned, others too scared. The officer stood above her, his shadow looming like a cruel reminder of his power. "Next time, stay out of trouble," he spat, slamming the lid shut. For a moment, everything was still. The students whispered among themselves, unsure of what to do. Inside the dumpster, the girl's heart raced, her body trembling with fear and anger. But then, in the distance, a voice boomed. "What's going on here?" The officer froze, his smug expression faltering as a figure approached, one that carried both authority and an unmistakable fury. "Open that dumpster." "Now," the voice demanded. "No need, sir," the officer stammered, trying to block the path. "It was just a small," I said. "Open it." The lid creaked open, revealing the girl's tear-streaked face. The man's jaw clenched as he turned to the officer, his eyes blazing. "Explain this. Now." Caught off guard, the officer stumbled through an excuse. She matched the description of a suspect. "I was just doing my job." "Your job," the man cut him off, his voice sharp and icy. "Your job is to protect, not humiliate a child." The tension was palpable as more students gathered to watch the confrontation. Phones were out now, recording every word, every gesture. The officer's authority was slipping away with each passing second, but he couldn't have predicted what came next. This wasn't just any man. This was someone with power, someone who had the means to expose not only this officer's actions but also the systemic failures that allowed such abuse to continue. And as the girl climbed out of the dumpster, brushing herself off with quiet dignity, it became clear that this wasn't over. What happened next would shake the entire community to its core, a reckoning that no one saw coming. Would justice be served? Or would the officer's power shield him from the consequences of his actions? One thing was certain, this story wasn't just about one girl. It was about the fight against a system that had failed far too many. Stay tuned to uncover the shocking truth of what unfolded in the days that followed. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, prejudice, and injustice in any form. We believe in the power of stories to inspire change, highlight resilience, and bring communities together. To every Black viewer watching, know that your life matters, your voice matters, and your dreams matter. Thank you for being here. Now, settle in for an emotional and powerful story that we hope will resonate deeply. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications for more impactful narratives. Let's get started. Enjoy the story. The town of Willowbrook wasn't much to look at. Nestled in the heart of the Midwest, it was a patchwork of quiet neighborhoods, aging schoolyards, and long stretches of farmland. The community was close-knit, but like any other, it had its cracks, hidden biases, unspoken tensions, and a simmering divide that too often was ignored. It was in this town that 15-year-old Layla Morgan had grown up. Layla was the kind of girl everyone noticed, not because she was loud or attention-seeking, but because she carried herself with a quiet confidence that seemed unshakable. Her braided hair framed her round face, her warm brown eyes always lit with a spark of curiosity. She was intelligent, determined, and compassionate, the kind of student teachers loved and classmates envied. But life hadn't always been kind to her. Her father, Thomas Morgan, was the town's sheriff, a man known for his unwavering sense of justice and calm authority. A towering figure with a steady gaze, he commanded respect without ever having to raise his voice. Thomas had worked tirelessly to rise through the ranks, often battling the very prejudices his daughter now faced. He was a single parent, raising Layla after her mother passed away when she was only 3. His devotion to his daughter was unmatched, and their bond was evident to anyone who saw them together. Despite Thomas's position, Layla wasn't immune to the subtle, and sometimes overt, racism that lurked in the shadows of Willowbrook. She felt it in the way some teachers seemed surprised by her academic achievements, in the cautious looks from store clerks, and in the whispers that followed her in certain parts of town. But Layla was resilient. Her father had taught her to stand tall, to meet ignorance with grace and strength. Willowbrook High School was a mix of students from various backgrounds, but its leadership had yet to catch up to its diversity. Layla excelled in her classes, balancing honors courses with extracurriculars like debate team and track. She had dreams of becoming a lawyer, driven by a desire to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. She worked hard, not just for her own future but because she knew her success would be a reflection of her father's sacrifices. Then there was Officer Daniel Hart. A man in his early 40s, Hart had been on the force for over a decade. He was the kind of officer who saw himself as a gatekeeper of law and order, but his version of order often aligned with his personal prejudices. Hart had a reputation that the community quietly whispered about but rarely confronted. He was stern, abrasive, and quick to judge, particularly when it came to the town's Black residents. Thomas Morgan had clashed with him on more than one occasion, but the complaints filed against Hart always seemed to disappear, buried under bureaucratic indifference. The day everything unraveled started like any other. Layla had just finished her last class and was heading out to meet her friends. Her father had reminded her that morning to text him when she was ready to be picked up, but she decided to linger a bit longer, catching up with classmates about an upcoming track meet. The schoolyard was alive with chatter and laughter, students spilling out of the building in waves. It was then that Officer Hart arrived. He had been called to the school to investigate a series of thefts, a routine matter that should have been handled discreetly. But Hart wasn't one for subtlety. As he walked onto the school grounds, his eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on Layla. She was adjusting her backpack, laughing with a friend. Something about her presence seemed to set him off. Maybe it was her confidence, the way she carried herself as though she belonged, a silent defiance to the biases he clung to. Or maybe it was her skin, a target in a world where he saw difference as a threat. "Hey, you," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. Layla turned, confused. She saw the officer striding toward her, his expression hard and unyielding. "Yes?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension she felt building. "You match the description of someone involved in a theft here," Hart said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Layla's friends exchanged uneasy glances. "I haven't done anything," she replied, her brow furrowing. "Open your bag," Hart demanded, his hand resting on his belt. "I don't understand," Layla said, taking a step back. "Why are you accusing me? I've been in class all day." "Don't get smart with me," Hart snapped. "Just do as I say." The scene quickly drew the attention of other students. Phones appeared, recording the confrontation. Layla felt her cheeks burn with a mix of anger and humiliation, but she refused to give in. "I didn't take anything," she insisted. "You're making a mistake." Hart wasn't interested in her protests. He grabbed her backpack, dumping its contents onto the ground. Books, notebooks, and personal items scattered across the pavement as a hush fell over the crowd. "There's nothing here," one student murmured, but Hart ignored it. "Where is it?" he demanded, stepping closer to Layla. She stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. "I didn't take anything," she said again, her voice trembling now. Hart's frustration boiled over. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the dumpster by the edge of the yard. "What are you doing?" she cried, struggling against his grip. "Teaching you a lesson," Hart muttered, his grip tightening. The crowd watched in stunned silence as he forced her toward the dumpster, lifting the lid with one hand. Layla's protests turned into a scream as he shoved her inside, slamming the lid shut behind her. Inside the dumpster, the stench of rotting food and trash filled her senses. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to push the lid open, but it wouldn't budge. Outside, the crowd was too stunned to act. But in that moment, as the humiliation consumed her, Layla thought of her father. He had always told her to be strong, to stand up for herself. And though she felt powerless now, she knew this wasn't over. From a distance, a familiar voice roared, cutting through the tension like a clap of thunder. "What's going on here?" The sound of footsteps grew louder, and the lid of the dumpster creaked open. Layla blinked against the sudden light, her tear-streaked face meeting the piercing gaze of her father. "What did you do?" Thomas Morgan's voice was calm but laced with fury as he turned to Hart. Hart stumbled over his words, trying to justify his actions, but Thomas wasn't listening. His focus was on Layla, on the injustice she had just endured. And as he helped her out of the dumpster, the weight of what had happened settled over the crowd. This wasn't just an incident. It was a spark that would ignite something much larger, a fight for justice that would shake Willowbrook to its core. The ride home from the school was suffocatingly silent. Layla sat in the passenger seat of her father's patrol car, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes fixed on the world outside as it blurred past the window. Her father, Thomas, gripped the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity, his jaw set like stone. The tension between them was palpable, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy in the air. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Thomas spoke, his voice calm but edged with suppressed anger. "Are you okay?" Layla didn't answer right away. Her throat was tight, her emotions a tangle of humiliation, anger, and disbelief. When she finally did speak, her voice was barely above a whisper. "How could he do that to me, Dad? In front of everyone?" Thomas's chest rose and fell as he took a slow, deliberate breath. "He's going to answer for what he did, Layla. I promise you that." Her head snapped toward him, her eyes brimming with tears. "But what's the point? People like him, they always get away with it. Thomas's grip tightened on the wheel. "Not this time," he said, his tone low and firm. They pulled into the driveway of their modest home, a small but well-kept house that Thomas had worked tirelessly to provide. As they stepped inside, the familiar warmth of the space felt oddly distant to Layla. She dropped her bag by the door and sank into the couch, burying her face in her hands. Thomas sat beside her, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "I need you to tell me everything that happened," he said softly. "Every detail." Layla hesitated. She didn't want to relive it, but she knew her father wouldn't rest until he understood every piece of the puzzle. Slowly, haltingly, she began to recount the incident, how Officer Hart had singled her out, accused her without evidence, and humiliated her in front of the entire school. Her voice cracked as she described the moment he shoved her into the dumpster, the jeers and whispers of her classmates still echoing in her mind. By the time she finished, Thomas's expression had darkened, his usually composed demeanor replaced with a barely contained fury. He stood abruptly, pacing the room as he processed what he had just heard. "That man doesn't deserve to wear a badge," he muttered, more to himself than to Layla. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice tentative. He stopped and looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "The right thing," he said. "For you. For everyone he's ever done this to." The next morning, Thomas was at the police station before the sun had fully risen. The air inside the building was thick with the hum of fluorescent lights and the murmur of officers preparing for their shifts. Thomas marched straight to the chief's office, his boots echoing sharply against the linoleum floor. Sheriff Morgan, Chief Donovan, greeted him, looking up from a cluttered desk. "What brings you in so early?" Thomas didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We need to talk about Officer Hart." Donovan's expression shifted, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "What about him?" Thomas placed his hands firmly on the desk, leaning forward. "Yesterday, he assaulted my daughter. He humiliated her in front of her peers, abused his power, and crossed every line imaginable. And I won't stand for it." The chief leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered Thomas's words. "I'm sorry to hear about what happened, but Hart has been with us for years. Are you sure this isn't a misunderstanding?" Thomas's eyes hardened. "A misunderstanding? My daughter was thrown into a dumpster because Hart decided to play judge, jury, and executioner. If you think for 1 second I'm going to let this slide, you're sorely mistaken." Donovan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, Morgan, you know how these things go. We'll open an internal investigation, but these things take time." "Time?" Thomas's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. "While you sit here dragging your feet, he's out there, wearing that uniform, tarnishing the badge we swore to uphold. How many others has he done this to? How many more will there be if we don't act?" The chief hesitated, the weight of Thomas's words sinking in. "I'll see what I can do," he finally said. "That's not good enough," Thomas shot back. "He needs to be held accountable, now." The rest of the day passed in a blur of tension and frustration. Layla stayed home from school, unable to face the stares and whispers she knew awaited her. Meanwhile, Thomas worked tirelessly, digging into Hart's record. What he found only fueled his anger. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct, all buried under layers of bureaucracy and dismissed as isolated incidents. As night fell, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him, papers strewn across the surface. Layla watched him from the doorway, her heart heavy with a mix of gratitude and worry. "Dad," she said softly, stepping into the room. He looked up, the exhaustion evident in his eyes. "What is it, sweetheart? Why are you doing all this?" she asked. "It's not like they're going to listen to you. He'll probably just get a slap on the wrist, and everything will go back to the way it was." Thomas stood, crossing the room to place a hand on her shoulder. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "And because you deserve justice. No one should have to go through what you did." Layla nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. The following days were a whirlwind of events. Thomas filed a formal complaint, complete with the evidence he had uncovered. He reached out to local activists, journalists, and community leaders, rallying support for his cause. The story began to spread, drawing attention from beyond the borders of Willowbrook. Meanwhile, Officer Hart remained defiant, dismissing the accusations as baseless and accusing Thomas of a personal vendetta. But behind his bravado, cracks began to show. He avoided eye contact with colleagues, his steps a little less sure as the walls closed in around him. The tension in the town was palpable. Conversations in coffee shops and grocery store aisles buzzed with the latest developments. People chose sides, some defending Hart as a good officer caught in a tough situation, others condemning him as a symbol of everything wrong with the system. And through it all, Layla found herself at the center of it, her name and face becoming a rallying cry for justice. She didn't ask for this spotlight, but she carried it with a quiet strength, determined not to let her father's efforts be in vain. As the pressure mounted, it became clear that something had to give. A meeting was called, bringing together the police department, community leaders, and members of the public. It was here that everything would come to a head, where the truth would be laid bare for all to see. But what no one expected was the twist that would change everything, a revelation so shocking, it would leave Willowbrook reeling and redefine the very fabric of the fight for justice. The meeting room at Willowbrook Community Hall was packed. The air was thick with a mix of tension, anticipation, and a faint hint of coffee from the urns set up in the back. The usual hum of polite murmurs before such gatherings was replaced with whispered arguments and hushed debates. On one side of the room, a group of community members sat with folded arms, their faces a mixture of anger and determination. Opposite them, several officers, including Hart, leaned back in their chairs, their expressions a careful mask of indifference. In the center of it all stood Sheriff Thomas Morgan, his presence commanding the room's attention without a word. Layla sat near the front, her hands tightly gripping the armrests of her chair. She had insisted on being there, determined to see this through despite her father's initial hesitation. The chief cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the low murmur of voices. "We've gathered here today to address the recent allegations against Officer Daniel Hart. Sheriff Morgan has requested this forum to present his findings and allow for public discussion. Let's keep this civil." Thomas stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room. His voice was steady, each word deliberate. "I appreciate everyone being here. What happened to my daughter was not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem, one that cannot be ignored any longer." Hart smirked from his seat, leaning over to whisper something to the officer beside him. Layla's stomach churned at the sight, but she held her ground, her father's unwavering focus giving her strength. Thomas continued, pulling out a stack of papers and setting them on the table in front of him. "This isn't just about Layla. Over the past decade, complaints against Officer Hart have been filed by numerous residents, most of them from marginalized communities. These complaints were dismissed, buried, or quietly resolved, without proper investigation." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Thomas picked up one of the papers, holding it up for the room to see. "This is a formal complaint from 3 years ago, filed by a young man who was stopped, searched, and detained without cause. He described the encounter as humiliating and dehumanizing, eerily similar to what happened to my daughter." Objection. Hart's voice cut through the air, dripping with mock indignation. "This isn't a courtroom, Sheriff. You're making me out to be some kind of monster." Thomas turned to face him, his expression calm but resolute. "If the shoe fits, Hart." A smattering of chuckles erupted from the audience, but the chief raised a hand to restore order. "Let's stay on track," he said, though his gaze lingered on Hart with a hint of discomfort. Thomas pressed on, his voice growing more impassioned. "This isn't personal, Hart. This is about accountability. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what my daughter went through." Hart leaned back in his chair, his smirk replaced with a sneer. "You're grandstanding, Morgan. You don't have proof of anything." Thomas's lips twitched into a faint smile, the kind that hinted at a trump card yet to be played. "Actually, I do." The room fell silent. All eyes were on Thomas as he reached into his bag and pulled out a small USB drive. He walked to the projector at the front of the room, plugging it in with a practiced motion. "What you're about to see," Thomas said, his voice steady but edged with a quiet intensity, "is footage from Officer Hart's body camera. It was submitted as evidence for an unrelated case, but it sheds light on a pattern of behavior that can no longer be ignored." The screen flickered to life, and the room watched as the grainy footage began to play. It was unmistakably Hart, his voice booming through the speakers as he berated a young man during a traffic stop. The insults were sharp, the threats thinly veiled. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as the video continued, Hart's tone growing more aggressive with each passing moment. As the footage ended, Thomas turned back to the room. "This is one example of many. And yet, Officer Hart remains on the force. Why?" The silence was deafening. Hart's face had turned a shade paler, his earlier confidence now replaced with a flicker of unease. A voice from the back of the room broke the silence. "How many more videos are there?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "Enough to establish a clear and undeniable pattern of abuse." Hart shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a witch hunt," he barked. "You're trying to ruin my career over a few isolated incidents." Thomas stepped closer, his eyes locked on Hart's. "Your career isn't being ruined by me, Hart. It's being ruined by your own actions." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Layla's heart pounded as she watched her father hold his ground, his presence a stark contrast to Hart's unraveling composure. Finally, the chief spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment. "Sheriff Morgan, this is damning evidence. We'll need to open a formal investigation." Hart's expression twisted into a snarl. "You can't do this to me. I've given years to this department. And how many lives have you damaged in the process?" Thomas countered, his voice calm but unyielding. The room erupted into a chorus of voices, some shouting in agreement, others in protest. Through it all, Thomas stood firm, his focus never wavering. As the meeting drew to a close, the chief announced that Hart would be placed on immediate administrative leave pending the investigation. The decision sent ripples through the room, the crowd buzzing with a mix of relief and lingering tension. But for Layla, the fight wasn't over. She could see it in her father's eyes, the determination to see this through to the end. And as they left the meeting hall, stepping out into the crisp night air, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. What they didn't yet know was that Hart had one last move up his sleeve, a desperate attempt to reclaim his power that would push the Morgans to their limits and test the strength of their convictions like never before. As the days stretched on, the tension in Willowbrook grew thicker. News of the meeting spread quickly, and with it, a growing divide among the residents. Some praised Sheriff Morgan for his courage and commitment to justice, while others whispered about loyalty, tradition, and how he had turned against one of his own. Through it all, Thomas remained resolute. He had faced opposition before, but this felt different, sharper, more personal. Layla could see it in the way he carried himself, his shoulders a little more tense, his jaw a little tighter. She wanted to ask if he was okay, but the words always caught in her throat. Instead, she threw herself into her schoolwork, trying to distract herself from the storm swirling around her family. It wasn't long before Hart made his move. One evening, as Thomas was going over paperwork in his office, his phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at the screen and froze. There it was, a headline splashed across a local news website, "Sheriff Morgan under fire, allegations of misconduct surface." "What the hell?" he muttered, grabbing his phone and clicking on the article. The story was filled with accusations, all anonymous, claiming that Thomas had used his position to intimidate officers, bend the law, and further his own agenda. It was baseless, of course, but the damage was immediate. Thomas's phone rang, jolting him out of his thoughts. He answered it, his voice tight. "Morgan." "Sheriff," came the familiar voice of Chief Donovan. "I assume you've seen the news." "I have," Thomas replied, his tone clipped. "There's going to be an inquiry," Donovan said. "You know we have to follow protocol." Thomas clenched his jaw. "Of course. But you and I both know this is Hart's doing." The chief hesitated. "Be that as it may, we need to address it properly. It's out of my hands." Thomas hung up without another word, his mind racing. He knew Hart was desperate, but this? It was an outright attack on his integrity, his career. He needed to act quickly. The next morning, Layla found her father in the kitchen, his face lined with exhaustion but his eyes burning with determination. "What's going on?" she asked, sensing the weight of the moment. "Hart's playing dirty," Thomas said, sliding his phone across the counter toward her. "He's trying to smear my name." Layla read the headline, her stomach sinking. "This isn't fair. Everyone knows you're nothing like him." "Fairness has nothing to do with it," Thomas said, his voice calm but firm. "This is about power. Hart's losing his grip, and this is his way of fighting back." Layla set the phone down, her hands shaking with anger. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to fight," Thomas said simply. Later that day, Thomas stood in front of a small crowd of reporters outside the station. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward him, and questions flew at him from every direction. "Sheriff Morgan, what's your response to the allegations? Do you believe this is retaliation for the investigation into Officer Hart? Are you planning to step down during the inquiry?" Thomas raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "These allegations are completely false," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I have spent my entire career upholding the law and serving this community with integrity. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to distract from the real issue at hand, holding Officer Hart accountable for his actions." A murmur rippled through the crowd, the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. "I will not be intimidated," Thomas continued, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces. "Justice is not about convenience or popularity. It's about doing what's right, no matter the cost." As he stepped away from the podium, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text message from an unknown number. It was a video. Thomas clicked on the message, and his breath caught in his throat. The footage was dark and shaky, but the voices were clear. It was Hart, talking to someone about taking Morgan down. "This is only the beginning," Hart's voice sneered. "By the time I'm done, he'll wish he never crossed me." Thomas stared at the screen, his heart pounding. This was the proof he needed, but the question was, who had sent it, and why? He didn't have to wonder for long. Later that evening, a knock on the door revealed a young officer, barely out of his 20s, shifting nervously on the porch. "Sheriff Morgan," the officer said, his voice trembling slightly. "That's me," Thomas replied, his gaze sharp. "Who are you?" "My name's Officer Daniels," the young man said, his eyes darting nervously. "I sent you the video." Thomas raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Why?" Daniels hesitated, his face pale. "Because it's the right thing to do. I've seen what Hart's been up to. He's been bullying people on the force for years, but no one's ever stood up to him, until you." I couldn't stay silent anymore. Thomas studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Come inside." As Daniels recounted everything he knew, Layla listened from the stairs, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and unease. Her father had always taught her to stand up for what was right, but the stakes had never felt higher. By the time Daniels left, Thomas had everything he needed. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The next day, armed with the new evidence, Thomas met with Chief Donovan and the Internal Affairs team. The meeting was tense, the room filled with a palpable mix of anticipation and dread. "This video," Thomas said, sliding his phone across the table, "proves that Hart's actions are not just unethical, they're criminal. He's been manipulating the system, targeting vulnerable people, and now he's trying to cover his tracks by attacking me." The chief watched the video in silence, his face growing graver with each passing second. When it ended, he set the phone down and looked at Thomas. "This changes things," he admitted. Hart was called in later that afternoon, his swagger notably absent as he entered the room. Thomas sat across from him, his expression calm but unyielding. "You think you've won, don't you?" Hart sneered, his voice low. "This isn't about winning," Thomas said evenly. "It's about justice." Hart leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You don't get it, do you? People like me, people in power, we don't lose. You might have your little victories, but in the end, the system always protects its own." "Not this time," Thomas said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. The meeting ended with Hart being escorted out of the station, his badge and gun stripped from him. As he passed Thomas on the way out, he paused, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't over," he hissed. Thomas didn't flinch. "It is for you." Layla was waiting for her father when he got home that evening, her expression a mix of relief and cautious optimism. "Did it work?" she asked, her voice tentative. Thomas nodded, a small but genuine smile breaking through his usual stoicism. "It's not over yet, but we're one step closer." As Layla hugged her father tightly, she felt a sense of pride she couldn't put into words. They weren't just fighting for justice, they were fighting for the soul of their community. And no matter what came next, they would face it together. The fallout from the confrontation at the station was immediate and far-reaching. Officer Hart's suspension sent shockwaves through the department and the community alike. For some, it was a long overdue reckoning, proof that even those in positions of power could be held accountable. For others, it was seen as a betrayal, a disruption of the status quo that left them questioning their own standing. For Thomas, the battle was far from over. Every step forward seemed to uncover another layer of rot, another piece of evidence that the system Hart had exploited wasn't just broken but designed to protect people like him. The inquiries were piling up, not only into Hart's behavior but into how his misconduct had been allowed to persist unchecked for so long. Layla noticed the toll it was taking on her father. He was still composed, still resolute, but there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. At night, she would hear him pacing the living room, his phone lighting up with calls and messages from allies and adversaries alike. One evening, as Layla sat at the kitchen table working on her homework, Thomas walked in, carrying a folder thick with documents. He set it down on the table, his movements deliberate. "More evidence?" Layla asked, her voice cautious. "Something like that," Thomas replied, sitting down across from her. He opened the folder, revealing pages of reports, internal emails, and handwritten notes. Layla leaned in, her curiosity piqued. "This is everything we've got on Hart," Thomas said, his voice low. "And not just him, there are others. Officers who looked the other way, supervisors who buried complaints. It's bigger than I thought." Layla's eyes scanned the documents, her stomach twisting with unease. "So, what happens now?" Thomas sighed, rubbing his temples. "We keep pushing. We make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. But it's going to get messy, Layla. People don't like change, especially when it threatens their power." She reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "You're doing the right thing, Dad. That's what matters." The next day, Thomas met with Chief Donovan and the Internal Affairs team again. The atmosphere in the room was tense, the weight of the ongoing investigation pressing down on everyone present. "We've uncovered a lot," Donovan admitted, glancing at the stack of files in front of him. "Enough to justify not just Hart's dismissal but a full audit of the department." Thomas nodded, his expression grim. "Good. It's overdue. But there's something else, Donovan added, his tone shifting. Hart's threatening to go public with claims that this is a personal vendetta. He's already reached out to several media outlets. Thomas's jaw tightened. Let him. The truth is on our side. That may be, Donovan said, leaning forward, but public perception can be a powerful thing. If this turns into a spectacle, it could undermine everything we're trying to do. Thomas leaned back in his chair, considering the chief's words. He knew Donovan was right. Hart was a manipulator, and he wouldn't hesitate to twist the narrative to suit his needs. Later that evening, as Thomas drove home, his mind raced with the implications of what Donovan had said. He wasn't afraid of Hart's threats, but he knew how easily public opinion could be swayed. He needed to stay ahead of Hart, to ensure that the focus remained on justice rather than on the smokescreens Hart was trying to create. When he arrived home, Layla was waiting for him in the living room. She had been following the news closely, her phone buzzing with updates from friends and classmates who were just as invested in the story as she was. "Did you see this?" she asked, holding up her phone. Thomas took the device from her, his eyes narrowing as he read the headline, "Disgraced Officer Claims Retaliation by Sheriff Morgan, a Case of Personal Grudges?" "Unbelievable," he muttered, handing the phone back to her. Layla frowned. "Doesn't this bother you? He's lying to everyone." "It bothers me," Thomas admitted, sitting down beside her. "But I can't control what he says. I can only control how we respond." Layla hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at her. "What if people believe him? What if they think you're the bad guy?" Thomas looked at her, his expression softening. "Then we keep fighting. The truth has a way of coming out, even when it feels like the odds are against us." In the days that followed, the investigation continued to gain momentum. More officers came forward, emboldened by Thomas's determination and Danielle's bravery. Stories of Hart's misconduct began to surface, painting a damning picture of a man who had long abused his power. But Hart wasn't going down without a fight. He appeared on a local news program, sitting across from a sympathetic host who nodded along as he spun his narrative. "This isn't about justice," Hart said, his voice measured but filled with bitterness. "This is about Sheriff Morgan settling a score. He's using his position to tear me down, to make himself look like a hero." The host leaned in, her expression concerned. "And why do you think he's doing that?" Hart smirked, the confidence in his demeanor sending a chill through anyone who knew the truth. "Because he's afraid. Afraid that people will see the cracks in his perfect image. He's not the saint he pretends to be." The interview sent ripples through the community, fueling the already heated debate about the case. But Thomas refused to be distracted. He focused on the facts, on the growing pile of evidence that painted an irrefutable picture of Hart's wrongdoing. As the pressure mounted, Hart began to unravel. His once confident facade cracked under the weight of the investigation, his allies abandoning him one by one as the truth became impossible to ignore. One night, as Thomas was preparing for yet another meeting, his phone rang. It was Daniel's. "Sheriff," Daniel said, his voice urgent. "You need to see this." "What is it?" Thomas asked, already grabbing his coat. "It's Hart. He's trying to make a deal." Thomas's pulse quickened. "What kind of deal?" "He wants to trade information," Daniel said. "He says he'll name names, other officers, higher-ups, if we drop the charges against him." Thomas clenched his jaw. It was a tempting offer, one that could potentially expose even deeper corruption within the department. But it came at a cost Thomas wasn't sure he was willing to pay. As he hung up the phone, Thomas sat in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew that whatever choice he made would have far-reaching consequences, not just for himself and Layla but for the entire community. The fight wasn't over, and the stakes had never been higher. But one thing was certain, the truth was within reach, and Thomas wasn't about to let it slip away. Thomas sat at the edge of his bed, staring down at his phone. The screen's glow illuminated his tired face as he scrolled through Danielle's latest messages. The officer had provided a detailed account of Hart's offer, names, dates, and promises Hart was making in a desperate attempt to save himself. It was a tempting lead, one that could blow the entire investigation wide open. But at what cost? Layla appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the soft light of the hallway. "Dad?" she asked gently. "Are you okay?" Thomas looked up, his face softening at the sight of her. "I'm fine," he lied, setting the phone down on the nightstand. She stepped into the room, crossing her arms. "You don't look fine. Is it about Hart?" Thomas nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly. "He's trying to cut a deal. He says he'll give up information on others if we let him walk." Layla frowned, her brow furrowing in thought. "And what are you going to do?" Thomas sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know yet. If what he's saying is true, we could uncover corruption that goes all the way to the top. But letting him go? After everything he's done? It doesn't sit right with me." Layla sat down beside him, placing a hand on his arm. "You've always taught me that doing the right thing isn't always easy. But if letting him walk means exposing something bigger, something that could stop this from happening to anyone else, maybe it's worth it." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of the decision they both knew he had to make. The next morning, Thomas met with Chief Donovan in the Internal Affairs team. The room was tense, the gravity of the situation clear in the furrowed brows and quiet murmurs of those present. Thomas cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "We have a situation," he began, his voice steady. "Hart is offering to provide information on other officers involved in misconduct, higher-ups, even, if we agree to drop the charges against him." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices, some arguing for the deal, others against it. Donovan raised a hand, silencing them. "This is a serious offer," Donovan said, his tone measured. "If Hart's information is credible, it could lead to a massive overhaul of this department. But it's a gamble. If he's lying, we lose our chance to hold him accountable." Thomas leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "I don't trust Hart. He's manipulative, and he's proven he'll do whatever it takes to save himself. But if there's even a chance he's telling the truth, we owe it to this community to find out." One of the internal affairs officers spoke up, her voice tinged with skepticism. "And what if we take the deal, only to find out he's feeding us false information? He walks free, and we lose our credibility." "That's a risk we have to weigh," Thomas replied. "But consider the alternative. If we refuse the deal, and Hart's information turns out to be legitimate, we miss the opportunity to expose a deeper problem." The debate continued for hours, every angle scrutinized, every possibility considered. By the time the meeting adjourned, a decision had been made. They would hear Hart out, but they wouldn't agree to anything until they could verify his claims. Thomas returned home that evening, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. Layla was waiting for him, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "What happened?" she asked as he walked through the door. "We're moving forward with caution," Thomas said, setting his bag down. "Hart's going to share what he knows, but he's not off the hook until we can prove his information is real." Layla nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "Do you think he's telling the truth?" Thomas hesitated. "I think Hart will say whatever he thinks will save him. But if there's even a shred of truth in what he's saying, it's worth pursuing." The following day, Thomas and a small team of investigators met with Hart in a sterile conference room at the station. Hart sat across from them, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, watching their every move. "So," Hart began, leaning back in his chair. "You've decided to hear me out. Smart move. Let's get one thing straight," Thomas said, his voice cold and firm. "This isn't about you. This is about finding the truth. If you're lying, or if your information doesn't check out, the deal's off." Hart smirked, tapping his fingers on the table. Fair enough. But you'll find that I'm very thorough when it comes to keeping receipts. He slid a folder across the table, filled with documents, photos, and handwritten notes. Thomas opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. The room fell silent as the weight of what Hart was revealing began to sink in. There are at least 5 officers involved, Hart said, his tone matter-of-fact. They've been covering for each other for years, false reports, excessive force, you name it. And the higher-ups? Let's just say they're not exactly innocent either. The team worked late into the night, cross-referencing Hart's claims with existing records. What they found was staggering. Hart's information was credible, and it painted a damning picture of systemic corruption within the department. By the time the investigation was complete, the scale of the problem was clear. Multiple officers were implicated, their actions spanning years of misconduct and abuse. The revelations sent shockwaves through the department, shaking its very foundation. Thomas sat in his office, staring at the stack of evidence on his desk. He had achieved what he set out to do, but the victory felt bittersweet. Hart's cooperation had been instrumental, but the cost of letting him go free weighed heavily on his conscience. Layla stepped into the office, her presence grounding him. You did it, she said softly. You uncovered the truth. Thomas looked up at her, his expression weary but resolute. The truth is only the beginning, he said. Now we have to rebuild. We have to make sure this never happens again. Layla nodded, her admiration for her father evident in her eyes. And you will. Because that's who you are. As the community grappled with the fallout, one thing became clear: change was coming to Willowbrook. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but the seeds had been planted. And as Thomas prepared to face the challenges ahead, he knew that he wasn't alone. He had the support of his daughter, his community, and the truth on his side, a truth that, no matter how painful, had the power to set them all free. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Hart sat at the defense table, his face a mixture of defiance and resignation. The investigation had uncovered undeniable evidence of his misconduct, but his cooperation had complicated matters. In exchange for the information he provided, he had avoided jail time, though his badge and career were irreparably destroyed. The court finds Daniel Hart guilty of professional misconduct and abuse of power, the judge declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. He is hereby stripped of all privileges associated with his role as a law enforcement officer and is barred from holding any public service position in the future. Hart's lips twitched in an almost imperceptible sneer. His punishment felt light compared to the weight of his actions, but the loss of his position, his identity, was a blow he couldn't hide. He glanced toward Thomas, who stood in the gallery, his expression unreadable. Layla was beside him, her hand resting on his arm for support. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, eager for statements. Thomas stood firm as the cameras flashed, his voice calm but resolute as he addressed the crowd. This isn't the end, he said. What happened here is a step toward accountability, but it's not enough. We must continue to demand better, from our institutions, from our leaders, and from ourselves. Layla watched her father with a sense of pride that swelled in her chest. He had always been her hero, but seeing him take on this battle, not just for her but for the community, had cemented her admiration. The past weeks had been grueling, but the outcome was worth every moment. In the weeks that followed, the department underwent a sweeping overhaul. The officers implicated in Hart's allegations were suspended, and a third-party audit was launched to address the systemic issues that had allowed the misconduct to flourish. Training programs were introduced, focusing on bias awareness and community engagement, and a civilian oversight committee was established to ensure transparency. For Thomas, the changes were a bittersweet victory. He had achieved what many thought impossible, but the cost had been high. The scars left by the battle, both personal and professional, would take time to heal. Yet, he stood proud, knowing he had upheld his values and made a difference. Layla returned to school with her head held high. Though whispers followed her at first, they quickly turned into words of encouragement and admiration. She had become a symbol of resilience, her story inspiring others to speak out against injustice. Teachers, students, and even strangers approached her, thanking her for her bravery and for standing by her father's side. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas and Layla sat on their porch, the warm glow of the fading light casting a peaceful hue over their faces. "You've been quiet," Layla said, breaking the comfortable silence. "What's on your mind?" Thomas exhaled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I was just thinking about how far we've come. How much we've had to fight for what should have been a given." Layla nodded. "It's not over, is it?" "No," Thomas replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. "But we've made a start. And sometimes, that's all you need to build something better." Layla leaned her head against his shoulder, a sense of peace settling over her. Despite everything, they had come out stronger, individually and as a family. As for Hart, his life unraveled further. Without his badge, he struggled to find purpose. His name became synonymous with disgrace, and he was shunned by the very system he had relied on to protect him. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, leaving him a hollow shell of the man he once was. In Willowbrook, the tides were turning. The reforms in the police department became a model for neighboring towns, and the community began to heal. Trust, though fragile, was being rebuilt, and the conversations sparked by the case led to a newfound sense of solidarity among residents. The story of Thomas and Layla Morgan became a rallying cry, a testament to the power of truth and perseverance. Their journey wasn't just about justice, it was about hope, resilience, and the belief that change, no matter how slow or painful, was always worth fighting for. As the screen fades to black, I want to leave you with this: what would you do if faced with injustice? Would you have the courage to stand up, even when the odds seemed insurmountable? This story reminds us that change doesn't happen overnight, it takes strength, persistence, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But above all, it takes belief in the possibility of something better. Let us know in the comments how this story impacted you. Did it resonate with your experiences, or did it open your eyes to something new? Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. And before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us at Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and leave you wanting more. Together, let's keep these conversations alive. See you next time.